Welcome to Ocean Encounters, a virtual series from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, or WHOI, as we like to call it for short. Tonight's event is Cities and the Sea, Challenges and Opportunities in the Urban Ocean. My name is Véronique LaCapra. I'm the host of Ocean Encounters. WHOI's public event series is now in its 7th season and is once again an endorsed activity of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. If you've tuned in before, thank you for your support. And if you're new to Ocean Encounters, welcome. I'd especially like to thank any WHOI members who are watching tonight for your support of ocean science. You are the heroes at the heart of our efforts. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let our Zoom audience know that they can participate in tonight's live conversation. If you have a question for one of our panelists, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen and type your question in the little window that pops up. You might be more familiar with the chat function in Zoom, but please ask your questions using the Q&A button instead. We often get hundreds of questions, so I apologize if we don't get to yours while we're live. You can ask questions anytime, starting now. I'd also like to remind our Zoom viewers that Ocean Encounters now has live American Sign Language interpretation. To enable the ASL feature, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're also recording this event. That recording will be made available on the whoi.edu website. We had more than 1,885 people pre-register to join us tonight, so you're in very good company. We also have viewers joining us right now on Facebook and on YouTube. To everyone, thank you and welcome. Let's get started. Many of the world's largest cities are located on the coast, where people and infrastructure strike a tenuous balance with marine life and ecosystems. In these urban oceans heavily altered by pollution and human activities, who struggles and who thrives? Tonight, we'll explore impacts, adaptations, and new possibilities in urban ocean regions around the world. As you can see on that map, tonight we're going to travel to urban oceans off Ghana in West Africa, Seattle in the US Pacific Northwest, and over to the other coast to the US Eastern Seaboard and Canada's Bay of Fundy. Let's bring on our panelists. They are Philip Hamilton of the Anderson Cabot Center at New England Aquarium, Eliza Heery of the University of Washington, Tacoma, and WHOI's own Amala Mahadevan. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
I'd like to start by having each of you briefly introduce yourself and the kind of work that you do. Philip, let's start with you. What do you do at New England Aquarium?
Sure. So Philip Hamilton, I'm a senior scientist at the Anderson Cabot Center at the New England Aquarium. And I study the North Atlantic right whale, which is one of the rarest large whales on the planet. There are only about 370 left. And we know that because we're able to identify each individual by their natural markings. In this case, you can see the callosity on the top of the head. That's unique for each individual, and it's similar to a fingerprint or face recognition software that we're familiar with now. And that's what has allowed us to know what the population is doing. Right whales can be identified by, they're all black. They have no dorsal fin. They have a V-shaped below, which is quite distinctive. And so you can see that from a distance and know it's a right whale. And they have these beautiful all black tails that have smooth trailing edges. So I manage a catalog of all the identified whales in the North Atlantic. It's a really collaborative effort all along the eastern seaboard, US and Canada, including some people from WHOI. And right whales are just the broad picture is they give birth in the winter months of December through March off the southeast US and can be found feeding off of New England and Atlantic Canada really throughout the year, but primarily the spring, summer, and fall months. So that gives you a little intro.
Yeah, some of our audience may be familiar with Michael Moore. He's a scientist at WHOI who's devoted his long career to the right whale. Thanks very much, Philip. Eliza, why don't you go next?
Sure. So I'm Eliza Heery. I'm an assistant professor of ecology at the University of Washington in Tacoma. I study urban marine ecology. So we know a ton actually about what lives in urban environments on land, but what lives underwater in cities is still a bit of a mystery. So I study what lives mostly on the seafloor in coastal cities. This includes focusing on things like urban seaweeds and urban corals. I'm interested in what shapes biodiversity in these impacted environments, and how the species there interact, and just how the whole system works.
Surprisingly beautiful and colorful. Thanks, Eliza. Amala, some of our viewers will recognize you from last season's Restless Seas episode of Ocean Encounters. But for anybody who missed it, please introduce yourself.
Yes, so I am an oceanographer at the WHOI Oceanographic Institution, and I'm fascinated by the microbial life in the ocean. What you're seeing here is an image created from a model animation, and each color is showing a different kind of phytoplankton. So phytoplankton are cells that photosynthesize. The microbial life in the ocean is rich. It consists of bacteria, phytoplankton, archaea, viruses, and these are moved around by the ocean currents, as you can see in this image. So the red in this image displays large cells. The greens and blues are smaller cells. They're moved around by the ocean currents. And I'm interested in trying to understand what sustains this life. So phytoplankton, very important because they are tiny, but they capture sunlight, they produce organic carbon, and they are the primary food source for larger organisms that then get eaten by fish. So they are sustain life in the oceans, but they also produce this organic carbon that some of it gets buried deep in the ocean. And so they help us help control the climate of the Earth or regulate the climate of the Earth through the carbon cycle. So my interest in studying how the ocean currents, the flow of water transports nutrients, carbon, oxygen, and the phytoplankton and microbial life itself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tonight's topic is the urban ocean. And as we'll hear, cities don't really end at the shoreline, like Eliza said. Eliza, so you specialize in studying these kinds of environments. Take us on a little tour of what's happening beneath the surface of the ocean, just off the coast of the city of Seattle in the Pacific Northwest.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I think we've got a little video clip here. This is a dive or series of dives I did with Rhoda Green, who is just shown there. I think about the urban seafloor as really an extension of the built environment. So when we're down there, we see all sorts of stuff that came from people. So here's a bunch of corrugated pipe, various things like to make this their home. We tie this together and put it down as kind of fish aggregating devices, but a lot of things utilize these structures. Tires are another thing we throw down there, not as much lives on them. But there also are all sorts of pipelines like this. This is a sewer pipeline that's been decommissioned with Metridium anemones growing on the sides of it, but really every bit of the surface here is covered in life. So lots to look at, lots to see. One kind of defining feature of these environments is that they're pretty nutrient rich. So a lot of the gunk that you're seeing in the water here kind of reflects that. This is a scallop. I think it's actually sitting on a bathtub or something like that that's been done. But so these are really nutrient-rich environments, and the way that we think about them is a bit different because the paradigms we would normally apply in urban ecology may or may not be applicable. So a lot of what we're doing is testing, are these paradigms applicable, figuring out who really thrives in these environments. It so far seems like a lot of detritivores, so things that eat the gunk that lands on the bottom, or the detritus, like these sea lemons, for instance, have a pretty good life in these environments.
I love those. So all the gunk we're seeing in the water, is that sort of a mixture of sediments and plankton and everything else?
It's a lot of plankton that kind of coagulates after a big bloom.
Okay. Philip, take us back to the other coast now, to New England, and give us a whale's eye view. What are some of the challenges facing this critically endangered whale?
Yeah, so it's it's interesting. Back in 2007, me and my colleagues wrote a book called The Urban Whale about right whales, and I think initially people were kind of surprised by it. But when you look at the eastern seaboard and what right whales have to navigate, there's tremendous shipping. So this is actually real data. The red dot is a 1-year-old female making her way up the coast, and all the blue is actual data from vessels. So those are all the vessels that whale has to navigate by. There's a tremendous amount of commerce on the eastern seaboard as well as military activity. So vessel strikes are a very big problem for right whales. They're also swimming through water with literally hundreds of thousands of ropes in them. And entanglements are a major cause of both injury and death. This is an animation of what it might look like for a right whale to swim through and how they get entangled. So we know that all the known deaths that are not calves are caused by humans, by vessel strikes or entanglements. More than 85% of all the whales have been tangled at least once, some of them as many as 9 times. And we've had up to 1,900 entanglements in this population. So it's both the mortality by these human-caused impacts, but also sublethal impacts are pretty devastating. Suffering, dragging stuff around. It's a real problem. We also know that ocean noise may very well be a problem, but it's harder to assess. But we had a really interesting opportunity when 9/11 happened. We were doing our surveys up in the Bay of Fundy, and we were collecting poop samples, which you could look at hormones and look at stress levels and reproduction. And we were recording underwater noise. And we did that before 9/11, and we kept doing it after 9/11, but all the shipping stopped. And we could actually measure a detectable change in the stress of right whales with a reduction of sound. So it was a really unusual opportunity because it's really hard to get at how does sound impact whales. And then finally, climate change is really an issue for this population. Starting around 2010, 11, they started shifting when and where they feed. And some of the places that they started feeding in, like the Gulf St. Lawrence, which is just above the Bay of Fundy in that graphic, a lot of right whales started going there, and there were no protective measures, and it led to an unusual mortality event with 13 deaths up there just in 2017. So climate change has an impact on Amala's small plankton, and then right whales feed on zooplankton, which are related, the next step up. And where those are aggregated has changed and has caused both harder for them to find these patches. They're sort of adapting to that, but sometimes moving into areas where they don't have protection. So it's a complicated world for right whales.
Absolutely. I think maybe it would be helpful for us to understand what these animals are going through if you give us an example. I know you've tracked a lot of different right whales in your career so far, but is there one in particular whose story really stays with you?
Yeah, so there are a lot. I've been doing it for a long time, but this is a whale named Wart, who was first seen in 1981, and her family is really kind of emblematic of the right whale story. She's responsible for at least 31 different whales coming into the population. She had 7 calves, 15 grand calves, and 9 great grand calves that we know of so far. Her family has been exposed to a lot. They've had at least 70 different entanglement events. 2 of her daughters, Slalom and Navis, were both entangled at least 6 different times. They also have not been immune to vessel strikes. Her son Shackleton swam up the Delaware River over 100 miles. This is Shackleton. And he had quite an adventure, which I may tell you more about later, but he got hit by a tug on his way out, but did survive. Her granddaughter, Infinity, was not as lucky. She and her calf of the year were hit by a 54-foot sport fishing vessel, and the calf was killed instantly, and she was mortally wounded. So that's the dark side of the story, but it's also a rich and interesting family. Some really interesting journeys. Shackleton, of course, swimming up the Delaware River. He got stuck underneath a pier near an oil refinery at one point. Really, really interesting. But then this is Wort's grandson, Mogul, who one year he swam from Cape Cod up to Iceland and back. And then the very next year swam from Cape Cod to France to Newfoundland, as this graphic shows. So in a little over a year, he swam over 11,000 miles. And what's also amazing to me, we know that just because people happen to be taking photographs in each of those areas, and they got to us at the North Atlantic Right Whale Catalog at the aquarium, and this story unfolds. So I love those unexpected parts, and there's still plenty of unexpected things to learn, I think probably for all of us on this call.
Oh, that's amazing. Amala, we've invited you back on Ocean Encounters to talk about something you've touched on last time you were on the program. Tell us about the new project you've really only just started in the Gulf of Guinea off of Ghana. What made you want to work in Africa, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so it's a very different region of the ocean. It's a tropical region. And what I mean by tropical is warm. The oceans are warm. If you think about oceans where the surface temperature is greater than 27 degrees Celsius, about 40% of the globe, is covered by tropical oceans. And I would say they're really vast, but relatively understudied, partly because of a lack of resources and attention that they've received. We are working now in the Gulf of Guinea on a new project. We started a collaboration with the University of Ghana and had this opportunity to work there through the Schmidt Sciences, an organization that put out a call for a project. And what we found is that the people at the University of Ghana were there is so much talent and such willing collaborators, and it's just so refreshing for us to go there and find all this energy, and we just jumped on that opportunity. So I want to say that the Gulf of Guinea is an interesting place because firstly, it's very understudied, very few observations, very few ships that make scientific observations, oceanographic observations have gone there in the last several years because of piracy and a lack of general infrastructure. But it's important, it's surrounded by 18 countries in West Africa surround the Gulf of Guinea. And there's a huge growing population, so the very fact that it's studied so little is one of the attracting things, but also I think the people there, have shown so much interest, and it's been great, to collaborate.
Yeah, so we can't see the countries on this map, but there's the countries in that little slice of Africa are actually quite small, so there's a lot of them packed in there. You actually just went to Ghana. Some of these terrific images that we're going to see tonight are from that trip. And as we will see in a bit, some of the scenes may not look terribly urban to us, but you were actually quite close to an industrial port city and not too far from Ghana's capital, Accra.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So Tacoma is a very big port, and we worked out of there. I just thought it could be a very fun quiz question to try to name the countries that surround the Gulf.
Ooh, I don't think I can do it, but that's a good idea. When you were there just now, you met with a number of local fishermen. What were some of the challenges that they're facing in Ghana's urban ocean?
Yeah, so firstly, I want to say that one of the there's a indigenous fishing community there, and these people, they've been working for many generations using canoes, wooden canoes, and you can see them here in the harbor, and they use nets and lines, and you can see they go out for a day or multiple days. They put their fish in this canoes and bring it back. Their fish stock has been declining to a point where it's really very worrying for them. And we were told stories of how they'd go out for a whole day, spend all this fuel. Fuel is very expensive there, and they come back without any catch. The reasons for that are not entirely clear. But firstly, I want to say there's trawlers that are competing with them. So there's mechanized trawlers, and they can't really compete with trawlers like this. Many of these are not owned by Ghanaians. They're owned by foreign owners. These oceans are warming, and the ecosystem is possibly changing. So they tell us anecdotally that, they don't see all the signs that they used to see before when there's an upwelling season, which occurs. I'll explain a little more. There's pollution. So as it's an urbanized area, there's a lot of pollution that comes from plastics, probably not even measured. Things like heavy metals and things haven't been measured, but the fishermen are worried. If I asked one of them who was on the boat with us, why do you think the catch has gone down? And he said, there's something in the water. And I hope that during the course of our study, we'll try to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, some amazing drone footage there. We're still a bit early in our conversation for audience questions, but let's see. My colleague Ken Costell is behind the scenes monitoring the Q&A. Ken, do we have any questions yet? What kinds of things are people wondering about?
Yeah, this is sort of a general one for any of the three to muse on. It's always amazed me that something like half of the world's population lives within 100 miles of the ocean, and 8 of the 10 largest cities are on the coast. Why are there so many cities and so many people so close to the ocean? Why do we cluster there when we are, air-breathing land mammals with most of our resources from inland?
Not really a science question, but who wants to take that one?
I mean, we always have. So looking back even into ancient times, the coast is where humans have clustered. The why, I feel like that's something much deeper than I feel qualified to answer. There might be some deep sociological aspect to it. I'm not sure, but just from a perspective of commerce and economics, it makes sense. It's a place where you can move goods easily, you can gain access to resources easily. That would be my brief.
That sounds about right to me.
Yeah, trade, trade is a big one. And
Yeah.
I want to say that if you go to the coast of Ghana, there are relics of some very dark history, which, we have to acknowledge. We know that the trade from there supplied the Western countries, Europe and America, with people for a long time. So
Yeah, slavery.
yeah.
Do we have time for another?
Sure, go ahead.
One just came in here from Teresa on Zoom. She says, how close, this is for you, Philip, how close are we to using ropeless or on-demand fishing gear, or I'd say any other technology to lessen our impacts on North Atlantic right?
I'm going to jump in here and say, let's wait on that because we're actually
yeah, you're right. That's coming.
We're going to get to that later, but we will answer your
Dangle that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's hold that one. Now we have a little bit of a sense what it's like for people and wildlife along some urban coastlines. I want to get into now some of your actual research and the impacts you're seeing in these urban environments. Philip, so I'm curious to hear more about how you study such a large marine mammal like a right whale, and what kinds of things are you studying about them, and how are you doing that?
Yeah, sure. And, one thing I'll start with is we have an incredible community that collaborates around studying right whales in the US and Canada. So I'll be saying we a lot, and it's not just us at the aquarium or me personally. So we use aerial surveys quite a bit in order to find out where whales are, get a sense of their distribution, where they're at risk, as well as to identify individuals. This is a mother-calf pair that we photographed from the air. We also use survey vessels to also do photo identification, but we also collect very detailed photographs of the scars in order to track the rate of scarring, human-caused scarring. It's how we know so many entanglements occur, because we don't actually witness that many. A lot of it is just the residual scarring. Like this is example of really massive scarring from an entanglement.
So all that white is scarring.
Right. It would be, right whales are beautiful, clean, black skin animals. And when you see, say, southern right whales that are not impacted by humans as much, like that's a beautiful, healthy, unscarred tail. That's the way they're supposed to look. We also collect skin samples using a crossbow with a modified tip to the bolt. This is an example of collecting one sample from a whale up in the Gulf St. Lawrence. It's amazing what we can get from that. We can get genetically identify the individual, which is particularly useful comparing, trying to identify dead whales who have decomposed so much their natural markings are obscured, or calves before they have developed their natural markings. We're able to determine paternities, investigate inbreeding and potential genetic impacts from past scarring. We can also look at reproductive stress and hormones. So it's an amazing tool. Another way that we can get those hormone data are not just from those samples, but also from collecting their poop. So poop is, we call it liquid gold in our field, because you can get so much from it. There's some of that liquid gold for you. And you can learn a lot about both prey, but also health, stress, reproduction. And for a little while, we actually started using detector dogs up in the Bay of Fundy. So this is me with, my dog was one of the 2 dogs that we trained to find scat at sea. And you can see he's very excited because there is a scat nearby, leaning over, tail going. We operate the boat to go upwind until we find it, collect it. And then in this case, they get, the reward is playing with a tennis ball. So that was a fun sort of addition to how we collect poop. We also use drones increasingly now. You can get very, very detailed measurements that can look at width and girth to detect pregnancy. In this case, we were also collecting below using the drone. And that below can be used to look at microbiome and also potentially hormone data. So the number of tools are increasing. Just a few of the findings that might be interesting. The distribution data, by doing these surveys, we've been able to get sort of an aggregate of where whales are. And in the Bay of Fundy, for example, we were able to argue that the shipping lane should be moved slightly. And so we did that in the Bay of Fundy using, here's an example of the shipping lanes, the way they were on the left, and how they were modified in response to the distribution of whales to reduce the likelihood of a vessel strike. Our surveys also can trigger seasonal management areas for both vessels and fishing gear, especially in Canada. The genetics are, always interesting, and inbreeding was a concern, and the recent data suggesting that's probably not having a big impact on the population, which is great to learn. But those studies actually also showed that the calves that are born are genetically more different than their parents than you would expect. And so right whales have a mechanism that's actually increasing their genetic diversity. And that's probably by calves that are too
from generation to generation.
Yep. So slowly over time, they're actually expanding their genetic diversity. So that is a rare piece of good news in this field. And then finally, the photogrammetry data from the drones is proving lots of really interesting stuff. Some people are detecting pregnancy. We've learned that right whales are not growing as long as they used to. And we've learned that shorter females don't give birth to as many calves. So we're starting to see the impacts of the sort of shortening of whales. So there's a lot more, but that's a good taste of some of the results.
Yeah, fascinating. And NOAA, I know, is a big partner in all of this as well.
We have a lot of partners,
Amala, let's go back to Ghana. What are some of the scientific questions you're trying to answer, and how are you involving the local community in all of that?
Yeah, so this region, there is a seasonal upwelling that takes place. And what upwelling is water from deeper down in the ocean comes to the surface. It's rich in nutrients and phytoplankton, which are the organisms that fix carbon using sunlight.
Plant-like.
Plants, they require nutrients and they require sunlight. So when those nutrients come up to the surface, then they reproduce and phytoplankton grow and produce a bloom. And that in Ghana is a seasonal event. It happens typically in July and August when the winds tend to be somewhat parallel to the coast. And one reason, there could be multiple reasons for this. One reason is that the white arrows that you see in this figure, the schematic is showing you the coast of Ghana, a shallow part of the ocean, which we call the continental shelf, and then it drops off and becomes deeper, and what they call the slope region. When the winds are somewhat in parallel to the coast, it's slightly in the northern hemisphere, it's at 5 degrees north, Ghana. We think that the effect of the Earth's rotation causes the surface water to move towards offshore when the winds are coming from the west. So this yellow arrow that you see is showing you the surface water being displaced offshore. And so when the surface water moves offshore, water from deeper down, the blue arrow has to come up to take its place. And along with that water that's, we say, upwelled, it brings, of course, colder water up to the surface, so we can see it in the surface temperature from satellite or from measurements. We hope to see it this summer. And it also brings nutrients, and those nutrients are like nitrate and phosphate in the water, which phytoplankton use to reproduce or grow. Then the phytoplankton are eaten by other kinds of plankton and zooplankton and small fish, and that's what leads to the fisheries. Of course, there's also a lot of influence of the urban environment that we're talking about, this, plastic and pollution coming out of the estuary. And we see, we can see signs of fresh water in the ocean from what we've seen so far. So this whole process, I think the communities, they have a really good empirical knowledge of it. They have an understanding. The fishermen told us that they have not seen this kind of upwelling occur as frequently or in as timely a fashion nowadays, based on the signs that they use. So a fisherman told us that in the past we would see the water becoming a little reddish, probably because of a certain kind of phytoplankton when the upwelling starts. They told us they normally see bioluminescence. So these organisms can produce luminescence, so light in the dark. Yeah, and they don't see that anymore. So something is changing. I think we are very interested in talking to them, working with them, making the measurements, trying to understand what causes the upwelling. Is it just wind? Are there other factors? Is it mixing? Are there some waves? There's equatorial waves that, because it's right at in the tropics, that could be affecting the upwelling. And what are the kinds of plankton that are growing? Is that changing in time? What does that lead to? Where does all that carbon end up that's being produced in this coastal zone? Is it falling on the shelf, or is it being carried offshore and falling deeper, in which case it's getting off the shelf, but also getting buried longer? So these are some of the questions that we are interested in addressing, but I think they're very relevant to the fishing community.
To the fishing community and to climate, depending on what's happening to that carbon, right? Eliza, you're in the Pacific Northwest, as we've said. What kinds of changes and patterns are you seeing there in terms of ocean life on the seafloor?
Yeah, so a lot of changes, not just in Seattle, but we work in a couple different places around the globe, and we're seeing some pretty big changes everywhere. Two that I will highlight are firstly a pattern of miniaturization. So as you go closer to city centers, we're finding that the community shifts from larger bodied organisms to smaller bodied organisms. that pattern is kind of juxtaposed at the same time with the pattern of, I'll call it gigantism, where there's certain opportunistic species that seem to just do really well and individuals can grow really big. But overall, the community is getting smaller.
Oh, hang on. What is that?
This is a polychaete worm. This is, I know when we talked about this before, and you were shocked at the size of it. This isn't really that big compared to some of them.
How big do they get again?
A good half meter, or a meter even. I might
3
not.
feet.
But they have some pretty massive teeth. This is under a microscope, so don't worry, they can't. It's not that. So yeah, that's one pattern we're seeing. Another pattern we're seeing is relating to carbon cycling. So filamentous algal turf is this kind of carpet-like algae that covers urban environments. You can see a picture here. It just looks like a fuzzy mat that covers everything. It's comprised of algae, so it's a photosynthesizer. It should be producing oxygen, taking up CO2. We've been finding that when subject to urban runoff, these communities, because they contain microbes and lots of tiny crustaceans, they're actually shifting from being a net carbon sink to a net carbon source. That definitely can change their role in the ecosystem.
So I know most of your research focuses on algae and small invertebrates, but there's one very macro species that seems to do well in Seattle's urban waters as well. Tell us about that one.
Sure. So the giant Pacific octopus is the largest known octopus species, and we have a lot of them in Seattle. Some of the work I did collaboratively with Amy Olson at the Seattle Aquarium and a number of other folks was trying to see whether they kind of correspond with urbanization. So we found that they may be synanthropic in deep urban environments. What does that mean? Synanthropic just means that their densities are higher where human density is high. So if you're on the Seattle waterfront, you're likely to be within a very close proximity to a really, really large octopus.
How big?
The largest ones grow possibly as big as 10 meters, 30 feet if they're stretched out really far from tip to tip. Most of them are not that big, but they're pretty mega for sure. We think it's mostly because of the junk that's down there. So there's just a lot of stuff, washing machines and bathtubs and cars and all sorts of things. Each of those items can serve as denning habitat.
So a place for them to hide, a place for them to live.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We've covered a lot of ground now. Ken, let's take some more questions from the audience.
Let's see. We had a couple of people ask about plastic pollution. I was wondering how each of you are seeing the effects of plastics in the ecosystems you work in.
Yeah, Amala, I know you're seeing it. Do you want to talk about that with respect to the fishermen?
Yeah, so, we haven't made any measurements. Right now, we see a lot of macroplastics in the nearshore region. When we were on a boat, we could see things floating. Right at the beach, there's a collection, and I think it's the city's waste that's coming out in the estuary and ending up on the beach. And it's, fishermen struggle because they have to go get their nets through this and get on their canoes. And sometimes you see them having to wade through this stuff. It also clogs the nets. So it's a problem, and it's not created by the people who are doing the fishing, but it's created by the city upstream, of the estuary. So I think it's a big problem here. We haven't looked at microplastics yet.
Yeah. But all of that colorful stuff we can see on the beaches is actually plastics and clothing, from what I understand, discarded clothing. I think actually Western countries, maybe the US as well, send old clothing to places like Ghana, and it just unfortunately ends up in places where it shouldn't, like on these beaches.
And there's also the nets,
Right.
So
Ken,
For right whales,
Yeah,
I'll just
go ahead.
throw in, obviously we have the net issue. Some of the things that right whales are getting entangled in is ghost gear. Um, I've always been surprised we do not, when the right whale comes up dead and they do a full autopsy or a necropsy, it's rare to find, in my understanding, large bits of plastic. There's a whale that died, wasn't a right whale, from having a CD case cut into its belly, but I'm really concerned more about the smaller the microplastics, because right whales they filter feed, they have baleen, and they're just taking in huge volumes of water just constantly. And I think that's a lot harder to assess.
All right, so the baleen whales are actually eating very tiny creatures in the water, and those small bits of plastic are around that size. So it seems like they would be consuming that too if that's in the water, right?
Yeah.
Eliza, did you want to comment about plastics or?
Yeah, I mean, I think as urban processes go, this is one of the larger scale processes. And in the few, we've just done a couple little looks at this in terms of trying to see if there is a gradient in microplastic concentration, basically, in different samples. And we haven't, that's relative to urbanization, we haven't found any pattern there. And I think it's just because it's such a ubiquitous problem. It's really everywhere. I think it is right to still tie it to urbanization because so much plastic is produced by cities.
Yeah.
But it's hard to see the gradient in practice because it's just all over the place.
That's interesting and disturbing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So we've talked a lot tonight about the challenges facing people and wildlife in urban waters. But Philip, give us maybe a little bit of hope here. Let's talk about some of the technologies that could help the situation for right whales.
Yeah, so there are some really tried and true ones that are currently in place. We use both seasonal and dynamic management areas that are based on, the seasonal ones are often based upon where right whales have been historically. So in this case, the pink are areas where there are slowdowns for ships seasonally. The boxes are actually dynamic management areas where a survey, or in some cases an acoustic detection, has shown that right whales are there. So those are two ways that we can manage risk, is through those areas. We have also been able to, so slowing down, I'm not sure I said this, but slowing down ships has proven to be effective at reducing the likelihood of a fatal strike. So that's one tool that we have that has been effective, maybe not completely effective. For entanglement, there are similar closures. It's really different in Canada and the US just because we have different management systems, but the basic tools are similar as far as seasonal and dynamic management. We also can fishermen can use weak links, which are a way to, this is from the South Shore lobstermen fishermen. They've been testing these ways to make ropes break at 1,700 pounds, which is strong enough for them to haul their gear. But if a right whale were to get entangled, or other whales, it would not be as harmful. So it doesn't really eliminate the problem, but it helps. We also have sinking ground lines in some area, which makes it less likely that a whale will get entangled in the line that is looping up in between traps near the bottom, the ocean bottom. But there also, to the question that was asked, there is ropeless or on-demand fishing technology, which is, so first of all, most of the ropes that whales get entangled in are not actually fishing. They're not the gear itself. It's just marking where that gear is and allows the fishermen to relocate and haul it. And so on demand, instead of having that rope in the water column all the time, you can ping the gear. In this case, there's actually a float that inflates, but in other cases, a coil of rope would just, with a buoy attached to it, would uncoil, come to the surface. So it's really promising technology. There are fishermen in both countries that are trialing it. It may not be appropriate for all fisheries. There's a wide range of receptiveness to this technology, but it does seem, what we really believe at the aquarium is industry needs to be really involved in the solutions because they know what they're working with. And so that's sort of the vision, is to really be working with fishermen and technology to improve. If it doesn't work now, how can it work for a different fishery? So those are some of the good things. There are other detection methods that are evolving. They're looking at detecting whales by satellite, using infrared, using sonar. They're using modeling. Passive acoustics is a really powerful one. Some of these are tried and true. Others, they all have some weaknesses. For example, passive acoustics is great, but not if whales aren't calling. And they don't call at the same rate or at the same volume in different habitats. So we really believe in using, the scientific evidence to support what is the best way forward, and testing these new things thoroughly, and probably using combinations.
I was going to say combinations. Sounds like the way to go.
Reduce the risk. Yeah.
All right. Amala, I know your research in Ghana is just really starting out, but I'm curious how the data you'll be gathering as a physical oceanographer, a scientist who studies currents, how could that help the local fishermen understand and maybe adapt to some of the changes and challenges they're seeing?
Yeah, so maybe a good way to explain that is by just telling you about a trip that we recently made there in January. The very first day of our visit, we met with the local fishing chiefs, and the fishing chief of every one of those communities came to a meeting that was called by our collaborator there at University of Ghana, who's seen in the blue dress, Edem Mahu, standing next to me. And firstly, we were really pleased that they all came willingly. There's a little bit of in such meetings, there's a little bit of ceremonial start to them in Ghana, which is, being welcomed, and us being glad to meet them, and them welcoming us into their community was very heartening. And we started by trying to explain to them and trying to ask them what they would like to learn, but also explaining to them some of the things that we wanted to do there. And they took a lot of interest. We explained we would be going out with a boat, trying to make measurements with an instrument, put some instruments out, and asked if they would be willing to cooperate and work with us. And they said they would be very interested, because if they are not, I don't think we could get any measurements, because it's impossible to leave a buoy out there and expect it'll still be there if they are not interested in it. So we invited the fishermen to come with us on a boat, and the University of Ghana worked with the Ghana Navy, and the Navy was so supportive. They offered us the use of this vessel, which is a former Coast Guard vessel, which they allowed us to use for the time that we were there. And here you can see that some of the people from University of Ghana, they are pulling in one of these nets, and they're doing a tow, and at the net is filtering water, and in the bottom, there's a little bottle which collects a sort of a concentrate of phytoplankton or plankton, but all kinds of plankton, not just phytoplankton. And we brought that into the lab and were able to look at it on the ship and show it to the fisherman who was with us and try to explain what the connection is between what's in the water, that's these plankton that are growing that are eat, and then you see a copepod, a zooplankton, and how that's food for the fish. So in the center image, you see a copepod. Mm-hmm. I think that was a very interesting experience. What we want to try and answer for them, they asked us, how is this going to help us, before they came on the boat, and we were trying to show them. And I think one question they have is, why is their catch declining? Is it because the upwelling is changing? Is it because the ecosystem is being changed? Or is it because there's overfishing? And it could be all of the above, or is it because there's pollution? And I think we would like to try to get at some answers to this. So we'd like to try to understand what the drivers of that upwelling are, what the physical drivers are. Can we tell the timing of the upwelling? The timing is crucial because what they do in Ghana is that they close the fisheries by mutual agreement amongst themselves in July. The upwelling season starts July and it goes on into August, and they close the fisheries so that the ecosystem can rejuvenate. But the timing of that closure is not changed from year to year. So I think that if we could better understand what the timing of the upwelling and the succession of organisms from phytoplankton to zooplankton to fish, what is the best time to close it, what areas should be closed and how, I think that that could help better rejuvenate the fisheries. We are also interested in understanding, the timing, but where is the nutrient coming from? Is it coming from deep in the ocean, or is it coming from just the shelf which is declining? And where is all of that phytoplankton growing? And I think that could help in managing the fisheries better. We're measuring temperature, salinity, currents, winds, and also all the biological effects downstream of that. So nutrients, chlorophyll, phytoplankton. This is just the beginning, but we hope to have a very collaborative working arrangement with the fishermen to try to understand this whole mechanism, how you go from upwelling to plankton to fisheries and livelihoods.
Yeah, great. Eliza, you've come up with some interesting ways to turn invasive species into something positive, working with your college students, from what I understand. What have you been doing?
With college students and others. It's not my ideas, but so Sargassum muticum is an invasive seaweed in the Pacific Northwest and in other parts of the world, including Europe. So we've been trying to figure out, are there novel uses of this seaweed in the built environment that would help kind of store up the carbon that it contains and the nutrients that it sucks up from the surrounding waters. We held a design thinking workshop with architects and designers to start this project, and we're trying to get their insights into what would be most useful as a new type of building material. And then undergraduate researchers in my lab were tasked with kind of checking the feasibility of those ideas. So trying to develop how that might actually work in practice, what collection and harvest would look like, to see if things are scalable and which applications are the most useful. The two of the things we've kind of honed in on so far are a sargassum insulation. Our undergrads have identified that sargassum insulation doesn't burn when you try to light it on fire. So it's useful. Also, it has a low thermal conductivity, so it seems to have some pretty good insulative characteristics. And then we're also messing around with using it as a novel form of carbon neutral concrete. So this is similar to something called hempcrete, if you're familiar with that, but it's replacing hemp with the seaweed. And yeah, the results are promising so far. There's a lot more to do here, and a lot more. We're really lucky to have collaborators in architecture and in the built environment generally, because they have great ideas.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we're running a little bit late here, but maybe we have time for one audience question, Ken.
Well, okay, it's sort of a double-barreled question.
Okay.
One person is asking, are there cities that are doing a better job than others of existing with the ocean? And in addition to that, Navi asks, are there marine protected areas in urban regions that are setting aside unique habitats?
Yes, you're nodding, Eliza. Do you want to take that one?
Well, so in terms of the first part, there are some cities that have committed more resources to understanding what's living there and how the built environment and what we do on land affects things. So Singapore is doing a lot. They're really investing in how to enhance the biodiversity on their seawalls and on other anthropogenic habitats. There's a lot happening in Sydney, Australia, I would say as well. There are several. New York also has a lot going on. There's oyster texture there, which is a pretty cool project. And there's a lot happening. The second part, I'm not sure about in other places in the Pacific Northwest. We have marine protected areas for certain species that are set aside in some pretty urban places. So octopus, for instance, are protected in a couple very urban locations in the Pacific, in the Puget Sound. So I think there are probably reserves in some places. Each city is really different, for sure.
All right. We are running really tight on time here, but I want to ask you one last question to each of you. If you could, you could have chosen to work anywhere, right? Places that are less affected by people, like a coral reef or somewhere on the high seas. What motivates you to work in urban ocean environments? Let's start with Eliza, then go to Philip, and then Amala.
For me, it's that they are really understudied. So there's just, I mean, despite the fact that they're right at our back doorstep, there is so much to discover, and that I think is really exciting. The other piece for me is that they really teach me about resilience. So things that live in these environments are inherently resilient, and I want to understand what that means in practice. So they're a great model system for that.
All right, Philip.
Yeah, I mean, I do not choose to work in an urban ocean. The urban ocean is what I'm presented with, and my species has been sort of urbanized. So it's definitely not by choice, but I do, I mean, it's really a powerful species to work with because we literally know every individual in the species. And so it's very personal. So it's a compelling thing to work. They're amazing people who come together. The community who studies the species they're special. They're working towards an underdog. And I think it's also sort of it's our responsibility, but my responsibility to, like, with open eyes say, oh, this is not a pristine ocean. This is an urban ocean. I need that in my face, which I have all the time, as a way of saying, no, we need to be more responsible to our oceans, to the species, all the species. But
all right, and Amala, you have the last word.
Yeah, I think, I'd say, like Philip, if one once is interested in working in the coastal ocean, and I think the coastal ocean is unique in many ways, although the oceans are vast, the coastal ocean has a big impact both on land and on the oceans as a whole. Then, because so many humans live by the coast, we end up working in cities. But I think that poses something very interesting. How do humans and the marine environment strike a balance? And we are seeing that very much in Ghana. I'll also touch upon the human aspect of it. A summer school was started in Ghana 10 years ago, and each year it draws so many people from all over West Africa. They get 600 applications, and they have to kind of admit just 100 students. So the interest of people to try to engage with this is also there. So those are some of the reasons. Thank you.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for tonight. I want to say a big thank you to Philip Hamilton, Eliza Heery, and Amala Mahadevan for joining us to talk about the urban ocean. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you also to all my WHOI colleagues who have been working very hard behind the scenes to make this event possible. And to everyone who joined us on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube, thank you. Tonight's event was the second in our 7th season of WHOI's Ocean Encounters events. Our next event is about sound in the ocean. It's coming up on March 26th, so please watch our website, whoi.edu, for more details about that. In the meantime, you might also want to take a look at the very cool merchandise at WHOI's online store, shop.whoi.edu. You get a 10% event discount for joining us tonight. Just type in the discount code URBAN. If you enjoyed tonight's Ocean Encounters program, you can be part of WHOI's solution-based approach to ocean science. If you're already a WHOI member, thank you very much. As you know, a benefit of WHOI membership is receiving our award-winning Oceanus member magazine. If you're not a WHOI member yet, please consider joining so you'll never miss an issue. You'll get other great benefits too, and you'll be providing crucial support for our outreach and our science. Memberships start at just $40 a year. The average gift is $120, but any amount helps. If you do become a member, please let us know that you watch Ocean Encounters. That will help us keep bringing you the science programming you enjoy. On behalf of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, thank you and good night.